Hi, Misha here, and as promised, we're going to do some more aircraft videos. I apologize for being a while on them, but life kind of got in the way, even though I had several on pre-order and then kind of just hanging out at Pete's Collectibles for a couple of months. To be fair, he had a lot going on too, so I think we both just kind of didn't worry about it for 6 weeks. But last time, which was months ago now, we talked about the F-102 Delta Dagger, the F-106 Delta Dart, which was originally to be the F-102B. That's the story, and we'll touch on it briefly. But today we're going to talk about the F-101 Voodoo from McDonell. Not McDonnell Douglas, just McDonell. Although next time, maybe we'll see what Douglas is up to around the same time period. What a story. Yeah. Canceled, brought back, canceled, brought back, had its role changed 3 or 4 times, and was both a success and a failure. Wasn't really successful it was intended for. No one even really knew what it was supposed to be, but then it found roles with the US and Vietnam, and really with its only major foreign user, Canada, where it would serve almost all the way to the end of the Cold War. And we have 3 1/72 scale die-cast models from Hobby Master. We have a couple of ones that have been out for a while. An F-101B that's US. One of the more recent F-101Bs from Canada. And the newest one, the F-101C, or rather the RF-101C, although they are going to do an F-101C from the mid-late 50s. So this is actually the earliest one. And actually being the reconnaissance version is quite important because, well, the single-seat fighter Interceptor bomber version, well, yeah, we'll get into it. But yeah, die-cast models, pretty good size. The 101Bs have been out for a while. The 101C just came out. There's a couple of versions and more on the way this summer. So with that, as with most of these videos, especially with the Century series, let's go back to World War II. Or rather, the end and direct aftermath, because actually it was German technology that kind of was the initial inspiration in McDonnell for this jet. After the war, the U.S. Army Air Forces wanted penetration fighters. The idea was long-range, supersonic, high-performance escort for bombers. They were looking forward to what would be coming, and that's what they thought would be on the table. Thus, in June of '46, specifications were laid out, and McDonnell started on projects along with Lockheed North American, who was kind of the head honcho thanks to the P-51, all made design proposals. This was originally to be the XP-88, but was soon changed within a year to the XF-88 when pursuit gave way to fighter, and the Army Air Forces became just, the U.S. Air Force. And kind of went neck and neck, and they were chosen to build a couple of prototypes, the first of which flew in October of 1948, the XF-88. And while it had decent handling and long range, it was slow, under 650 miles per hour, not what they were looking for. That was thanks to the Westinghouse the J-34 engines. Westinghouse had really been leading the way back in the day with like the P-80 and all that, but they were really not ahead of the curve. Therefore, McDonnell would add afterburners, making the XF-88A, which gave it greater speed, climb, but also meant it was a fuel guzzler. Either way, they ended up beating the competition from North American Lockheed and were awarded a contract. But this would not last. In 1949, Russia became nuclear, and in 1950, early on, the Air Force canned the whole penetration fighter program, changing needs, changing times. So it was dead, right? Not really. The Korean War kicked off and they thought, oh shit, never mind, bombers actually do need escorts. So it was on again by 1951 for a bomber escort, and each company kind of resubmitted a design with updated proposals, and that would be kind of a larger version of the XF-88 that McDonell submitted. It had 3 times the internal fuel, it had the high T-tail we know, and it featured the updated J57 engine, which really helped. We had 2 of them that led to engine bays needing to be redesigned, and it was originally the aircraft was to be armed with a 620mm cannon back in the original 1948 days. By this point, they're looking ahead to guided missiles, rockets, nuclear things. Long story short, by the late spring of 1951, McDonell is awarded the contract. Now, they weren't going to do prototypes and test models. They were just going to make a initial small production run. I believe it was a 29 fighter aircraft. In the late year, the name was changed to the F-101 Voodoo, F-101A. And in 1952, as the war would go on, and this would still kind of be under SAC, Strategic Air Command, they would change the fighter role. It now would still be expected to be a long-range escort for bigger bombers, but secondary role would be as a tactical bomber itself, a nuke deliverer, essentially attacking airfields or other high strategic targets. So this would be redesignated as a strategic fighter. Yeah, so with this and some other changes in mind, McDonell would make a full-sized mock-up complete with dummy nuclear weapon. In early '53, the Air Force would examine it and give it the go-ahead and full production rights by May of that year. So things are on track, and they're underway producing the first F-101A. It actually flew in September of 1954. So all's well, all's good, right? It even hit Mach 1, or just about, on its first flight. This will be using the J57P13 engine, 2 of them at this point. Well, guess what? Air Force changed its mind yet again in April earlier that year, in 1954. With the Korean War over, with the new B-52 coming around soon, which was felt to not need escorting, and of course with post-war budget cuts. Remember a time when the military actually had to adhere to a budget and couldn't just spend freely? Well, so even though the prototypes, production models, but the first production models, essentially prototypes, were already underway, the government issued a stop work order to McDonell. So it looks like the project is dead again. So with that in mind, why do we have F-101 models on the table? But it surprised you to learn they would change their mind for a, 8th time? I've lost track. Now we can put one on the spinny thing. Like I said, this was an RF-101C, the photo reconnaissance. The original F-101A was fitted with those Pratt & Whitney J57P13 engines, and it was able to hit Mach 1.5, and it was able to hit production because in November the Air Force changed their mind again. Well, SAC was not interested, but TAC, the Tactical Air Command, well, they had a need, and they pretty much said, hey, this would be a good base for a tactical bomber rather than a strategic fighter. Let's make some changes. They made well over 2,000 changes, and flight testing resumed in 1955. And it was designed to deliver a Mark 28 nuclear weapon. Although it could deliver others, it could even carry conventional ordnance, although it never actually did. After testing and trials, it was finally put into full rate production in November 1956. Again, we're talking about the standard F-101A fighter. It was fitted with 4 Colt Mark 39 cannon, 20mm, although some would only have 3 on board. And it had a centerline hardpoint for that one nuclear weapon, and it had 2 other hardpoints that were plumbed to carry 450-gallon tanks. Plus it had quite good internal tankage, which gave it actually very good range of at least 3,000 miles. Some sources say with the external tanks and everything up to 3,800 miles. Like I said, it could easily hit Mach 1.5, which by today's standards, okay, not that impressive. But back in the mid-50s, especially for a plane that had been reworked, yeah, not bad. Really wasn't. And it would start to enter Air Force service with the TAC in July of 1957. The first production deliveries had been that prior May. So with that out of the way, what about the photo reconnaissance? The version that actually saw combat. Going back to 1953, October, the Air Force asked McDonell to make 2 prototype photo reconnaissance versions, designated as the YRF-101A. Essentially, it was the same airframe. In fact, the center line would still be wired to take a nuclear weapon, although they would never carry one in anger. It took the same drop tanks. It would have the same J-57 engines, single seat, but the nose would be replaced. They'd get rid of the radar system. Originally it had an MA7, air-to-air and air-to-ground. In fact, the original 101A had the lab systems, the low-altitude bombing system, because it was part of that whole TOS bombing thing. Yeah, coming in low and fast. Some other aircraft did that. Maybe even from a manufacturer that would one day partner with McDonnell for the Navy. But anyway, so they would get rid of that, and in the nose they would install, well, the reconnaissance version would have a total of 6 cameras. There would be 4 in the nose, 1 kind of forward, 1 to each side, 1 straight down. Those would be for relatively low altitude. And then where the weapons would be, specifically the cannon that had been removed, part of their mechanism would be taken up with 2 vertical cameras for high altitude. So a total of 6 cameras, and of course, old school film cameras, digital. So it had no weapons, except it could technically carry a nuke on the center line again, but it never did. It had a few other minor tweaks. Now we're still talking about the RF-101A. It would first appear in 1956 with test flying, but also in 56, TAC had noticed that the 101A's airframe wasn't as strong as they'd hoped. They'd already reinforced it a bit when transforming it for their needs, but they were really wanting more out of it. So we would get the 101C in 1957. The first C would fly the summer of 1957, and it would enter service by 1958. It would basically just have a reinforced airframe, about 500 pounds heavier, but this allowed it to take an extra full G of force in flight, which is just good all around. It also had a revised fuel system, which gave better performance when using the afterburner, and it had a couple of very minor aerodynamic tweaks, including adjusting the strakes on the wings, things like that, but very small things. So, of course, the reconnaissance would also get the 101C updates. To be fair, either the F or the RF versions, the A's and C's were often used interchangeably. The differences weren't big enough to really make a distinction, although it did kind of limit A production. They would only build around 37 of the RF 101As. That included the 2 prototypes, and they would build 166 RF-101Cs, so considerably more. And kind of funny thing is, some of those were actually originally meant to be F-101Cs, but instead were built up as the reconnaissance version because it was kind of proving to be more useful in the ever-changing role of this poor old aircraft. But regardless, the tactical fighter, Interceptor versions, whatever you'd like to call them, with a potential nuke carriage delivery deterrence, deep penetration, they would be in service by 1958 along with the reconnaissance versions. And actually these would make a name for themselves in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That fall, the RF-101s would make several flights over Cuba. Very dangerous missions. Of course, the U-2s would as well. They wouldn't be the only reconnaissance aircraft there. And this gave them some notoriety and also some real-world field use. And they did notice that the 101A had some issues that the 101C, didn't focus in on as much. There were still some handling issues. In fact, there was one crippling one that they tried to address several times, but never did. The tip-up issue with essentially the planes falling out of the sky. But because of how the A's and C's performed over Cuba and elsewhere, when Vietnam heated up, and these had been stationed in Southeast Asia for a few years already, especially with Taiwan. 8 had been given to Taiwan. They were RF-101As, although they did have a few updates, and Taiwan would fly them over China. Was that legal? No. But plausible deniability, right? Either way, 64 Vietnam War kicks off. The RF-101C here was the only Voodoo variant to see actual combat. Well, at least actual combat theater use, because they were unarmed reconnaissance versions. They would be used, of course, to take photographs of potential targets and get intel. They would also be used after bombing raids and fighter raids to see what damage had been done. And they were even used early on as pathfinders, essentially, paving the path for the F-100 Super Sabres, which were used as fighter bombers in 64, 65. And for the most part, their speed protected them against MiGs, especially the early MiGs. But by November of 64, the first Voodoo would be shot down. Now in 67, they would get ECM pods, and that would try to protect them against SAM missiles locking on. But by 67, Mach 1.5 wasn't quite as fast as it once seemed to be. Another issue they ran into in Vietnam was that they weren't really good at taking photos at night. Now, a couple of programs, Toy Tiger comes to mind, tried to improve their night abilities, but they were only moderately successful. The point is, the RF-101C, the aircraft itself was never designed for this role. Yes, it let them retire their old RB-57 Canberras, which I've actually done a video on a long time ago here. Should revisit. So it's better than that, but the new RF-4C, and for that matter the RF-4Bs being flown by the Navy Marines, were coming online by 66, 67, and in a lot of ways were better. So between 65 and 70, these are slowly but surely phased out of theater in Southeast Asia. But they actually would continue on in active service into the 70s for a little bit, although production was long over. I believe Voodoo production was ended by 1961, 62 at the very latest. I don't mean repair and refurbishment, I actually just mean, new airframes. As to Hobby Master's model here, this is really unique. We'll look at this two-seater in just a second, minute. But it is a different aircraft. Of course, the canopy and nose are different, but also the engines and even the wings are different. Even the landing gear and the doors for them are different. Of course, it doesn't have any weapons on it, but it does have a center mount where the stand plugs in, so if they do the F-101C as promised, they can put a nuclear weapon there. Or not. Hobbymaster seems reluctant often to carry nukes on their planes, but sometimes they will. And it has the 2 drop tanks. These are the early ones. This model, which is the first release, is from Operation Sun Run, 1957, November 27, when these were used to race from coast to coast in America. LA to New York and back, also LA to New York straight and New York to LA straight. They did just over 3 hours from LA to New York, just over 3.5 hours New York to LA, and about 6 hours and 46 minutes round trip. For a time, this was about the fastest plane going. And they had this kind of natural metal finish originally. Although when they would go to Vietnam, they would very quickly get the Southeast Asian camo scheme. Although at first they didn't. And a lot of these would go to Vietnam. This particular plane would as well. And I believe it was lost there. They did lose some in Vietnam, like I mentioned. Between 37 and 39 total. No one knows the exact number, it seems like. Most, 31, 33, were to enemies. I believe 5 were to SAM. Only 1 or 2 were to MiGs. The rest were just other, causes. And then 6 were lost to accidents. So not a huge attrition rate, not like the Thud. But, well, this was a very dangerous mission it was flying. And they flew a lot of sorties. And this was not an all-weather aircraft. I mean, really didn't have a radar. It had some ECM for defense. That's about it, frankly. Pilots, like them, but while it was a very fast, nimble aircraft, it had that pitch-up issue, a few other kind of quirks of handling. But that's kind of what you see with the whole Century series. Looking at the F-100, the 102, 106, the 104, they all had their quirks because this was really pushing the technological envelope. But before we move on to the B model, how did the standard, well, I keep throwing a strategic, I apologize, the tactical fighter, bomber, the A's and the C's do? Well, they didn't have a very illustrious or even a very long career. The RFs served longer. But in completeness' sake, in the late 50s, the A and C models would replace the F-84F. That was something that needed to be done. Look up the Thunderstreak and you'll understand why. They were mostly stationed in the U.S. as bomber interceptors and kind of just strike. But really the big international use was 3 squadrons sent to England, Bentwater, home of the big UFO thing, Rendlesham Forest. Anyway, that was a little... Yeah. But the idea was they could pretty much hit anywhere in the comm block, in the Warsaw Pact or Soviet Union directly. They could really penetrate the pilots of the 101As and 101Cs, and again, they were used interchangeably. I don't really think there was a distinction made in this role. They would each carry 1 nuclear weapon, and primarily they were given targets of airfields. They would come in fast and low, use their labs to toss a bomb, and for one thing, nuclear war, it was always going to be a one-way trip for everyone. I'm just thinking of the end of Dr. Strangelove right now. But no, the idea was after they delivered their ordnance, they were to eject. Not just eject behind enemy lines. Behind enemy lines that they had just helpfully irradiated. That's not great for a reason or two. Yeah. But anyway, when you're in a doomsday scenario, I guess it doesn't really matter. But luckily, of course, unless you're in that reality where it did happen, but in my Mandela effect universe, it didn't happen. We didn't have to use these for nukes. Again, the RF versions could actually carry a nuke too. I just find that funny. They would build 77 A's, although only 50 were fielded. The rest were kept for testing or trials, like NASA used some, what have you. And they would build 47 C models. The F-101C, not the RF. And these would mostly be retired out in 1966, and some would be scrapped. Now, some would be converted to photo reconnaissance themselves. The A's would get the photo camera nose, becoming the RF-101G, and the C's would get the photo nose, becoming the RF-101H. 29 A's and 32 C's were converted, and these were handed directly over to the Air National Guard. But would only fly for a few years. These converted fighter frames would be out of service by 71, 72. Although the RF-101C, the lower flight hour ones, and the ones that survived Vietnam, would actually continue on in service until 1979, at least in some capacity. And thus, we come to the end, at least for the single-seat versions. See how confusing it is? And a lot of the differences are internal. We've, had the A, the B, the C. The D and E were never actually made. There were actually versions that were proposed to switch from the J57 to the J79, a very famous and successful engine. The F we're about to talk about, and then, of course, the G and the H were upgrades and conversions. And the only ones of these that saw foreign service were those 8 given to Taiwan, of which they actually lost 2 in operations. And they would retire theirs, of course, in a few years as well. But why is it that when you go on the internet and you look up the Voodoo, you actually don't find much on the 101A, 101C? No. If you look on, say, Wikipedia, down at the bottom, the tech specs are actually for the 101B. Why did it become so popular? And why did Canada fly it for a quarter century? This is the McDonell Voodoo you find online the most, and this was the one that Hobbymaster made much earlier because this was by far the most produced version. In fact, well over half of all Voodoos were 101Bs or 101Fs. We'll get to that. So you know how TAC kind of found Sachs disregarded aircraft and modified it to their needs, and then the Air Force modified it to be a photo of reconnaissance, and it kind of fit both roles. Well, it happened again. Going back to late 1953, the Air Defense Command, or at least what would become the Air Defense Command, was needing a high-speed, supersonic, high-altitude or low-altitude interceptor against those Russian bombers. Now, originally, they were going to do the Convair F-102, but it was a disappointment. So, the next plan was the F-102B, which would evolve into the 106, the Delta Dagger, Delta Dart. But it was going to take longer than anticipated. There was kind of a gap there. So they needed something to fill it. So in late 53, they announced a competition. They put out a design proposal request, and the usual suspects came back: North American, Northrop. And most of the time they were kind of updating their older designs, like the Scorpion, the F-100, or the 101 in this case, essentially because one of the requirements was 2 seats. Of course, front would be your pilot, rear would be your weapons officer. And in June of 54, the Air Force selected McDonnell's 101B. Now, to be fair, McDonnell wanted to call it the F-109 because it felt like there were enough changes. It was really a new aircraft, but kind of the same reason they tried to make the 102B that instead of the 106. Those pesky budget cuts, where it didn't work there with the Convair, but it did stick here, so it would become the 101B Voodoo, and 2 prototypes under the F-101B would be built, and they would first fly, I believe it was in 1957. And it wasn't just, hey, let's put a longer nose and 2 seats instead of 1. No, this is a pretty different bird. I mean, don't get me wrong, we do have a longer nose. This actually uses the same Hughes fire control system, or at least a version of, for the F-102, F-102B that was in there. What was it, the MG-13, I believe? It also was given a data link to the ground, so the SAGE system could use the autopilot to steer it towards a target. And of course, having 2 seats and a whole new canopy. Interestingly, instead of 2 separate cockpit hatches, canopy hatches, it was actually one big piece, and the Hobbymaster does illustrate that. This really is how the real world aircraft worked. Seems a little odd to me. You kind of have to slot this in if you want it to stay in the open position, but I'm not going to futz with it. Said I'd point that out. But really the biggest change had to do with the engines. While the prototype still had the J57 P13 engines, and these were acceptable, the actual production model would have the J57 P55 engines. That's why it's just big back here. In fact, these just stick out. I think it's like 8 feet from the fuselage. Now, they could have redesigned the engine bays, reworked the whole airframe, made it a little sleek, but they didn't want to do that. They needed to get it in service. It didn't hurt anything. They made other aerodynamic improvements. So, yeah, let's go with it. They also added these vents on the middle of the fuselage up here. Either way, the reworking and the new engines gave it a top speed of over Mach 1.8. So, pretty superior to the original. And we're carrying more equipment. This is a true all-weather capable version, and had at least some basic ECM for defense, and more would be added later in the mid-60s when they would do an Interceptor upgrade program. I don't believe the B was ever stationed outside the U.S. I believe these were kept on station in the U.S., but please correct me if I'm wrong. But very interesting. He took an already long aircraft, nicknamed the Long Bird in Vietnam, and made it even longer. By the way, these did have aerial refueling. In fact, a couple of different methods, as did the A's and the C's, and they were even capable of buddy refueling, which was not something pioneered on the Voodoo, but it was still a very new concept in this time period. So, what's at the heart of this? We talked about the Hughes Fire Control Group and the data link system. What's this aircraft's teeth? Offense. Gotta flip it upside down here. We still have the 2 drop tanks. We don't actually have a centerline hardpoint anymore. Also, just as a side note, the gear doors, as I mentioned, had bulge. That's for the larger tires. And I believe the front might have been a double wheel, but I could be wrong. Let me know. Anyway, this did not have the cannon. Those were removed. In its place, we have this really unique pallet system. And some sources say that it originally was meant to carry 6 Falcon missiles, but at least in practice, it seems to have been 4. Originally, 2 on each side, and there would be 1 semi-active radar-guided, and there would be one IR thermal. Essentially GAR-1 and GAR-2, later AIM-4A and AIM-4B. So basically, they would fire both and then flip the pallet over, hoping that one or the other would hit the target, because this was an interceptor of Russian bombers. And that's how the first production Bs came off the assembly line. But very soon, they became nuclear capable. That's what you can see here. Now this was the only nuclear weapon, the good old Genie, 1.7 kiloton. This was an unguided nuclear rocket, 2 of them to be exact. And I believe the designation was Air 2, at least after the pre-62 was MB1. But yeah, basically shoot these at a formation of Russian bombers, and well, hell, it's a nuke, it's going to do something. So this was the standard kit for later production. And then around 61, 62, the original earlier airframes were updated. So by the mid-60s, pretty much all your Voodoos carried 2 Genies and then 2 Falcons on the other side. Although, of course, in practice, I'm not sure how many ever had the nukes on board all the time. Although they could. This was part of the Air Defense Command, part of a strategic network, a shield to protect America. I should also point out that after the Genies were introduced, the AIM-4As and Bs gave way to the AIM-4C, the GAR-2A. The Falcon's its own story. I just thought I'd mention that. Also, during that improvement program in the mid-60s, the Fire Control Group was updated in the electronic countermeasures, and sometimes even the electronic countermeasures, to go against enemies were updated. So they did try to improve where they could. But keep in mind, this was always meant to be an interim solution, so not something they were really going to do a whole lot with. Nevertheless, they built quite a number of these, including that one in F-101B with the earlier P-13 engine. They would do 480 of these 2-seat interceptors. They would also do 79 TF-101B 2-seat, or they're all 2-seat, sorry. I've been doing this a while. Dual control trainers, but these are still fully combat capable. And then they would do the F-101F, which was essentially 152 converted F-101Bs. Basically, they gave controls to the backseater. And retroactively, the TF-101Bs became F-101Fs too. So, over 200 of those trainers, which were still combat capable. So yeah, quite a big run if you count everything, a majority, because they would do 807 Voodoos in total, everything. This would enter Air Defense Command service in January 1959, and production would end by the end of 1961. But service would continue. One other thing I forgot to mention, in the 60s they would get this infrared and the Erst up here. You see this appearing a lot on aircraft in this era. I did look, and Hobbymaster really hasn't done an early 101B. The earliest one I could find on their website was, 60s-ish, which I don't know if it has the Erst on it or not. That means they definitely didn't do one with just the Falcon missiles. I think they all have the Genies. Anyway, I looked. So yeah, these were just Air Defense Command. They were interceptors, nuclear ready, but again, thankfully, never had to use them unless you do want to live Fallout in real life. But by the late 60s, they were aging out, which, to be fair, they'd been in service for a decade. They were only meant to be a stopgap By this time, the 106 was available. So starting in 68 and running through 71, they started to be retired out of, the frontline service. And many would be sent to the Air National Guard, where they would continue to be used, and of course smaller and smaller numbers up until 1982, when the last one was retired in September. But they let the Air Guard retire their old F-102s, which frankly, while the 106 was quite a good aircraft, the 102 was always pretty disappointing, if I'm being honest with you. So that was the end in America. So the reconnaissance planes are on 79 out of service, and the two-seat interceptors out of service in 82. But of course we have one more model and one more story to tell, and it is in some ways eerily similar to the ones we've already had today. Oh, Canada. So in the 50s, for air defense, the Interceptor was the CF-100 Canuck. No, not the North American. This was from Avro. But it needed replacing. No problem. They had something waiting in the wings, the CF-105. And actually, it was going well. Design and development was pretty much over. It was ready for testing and adoption. One problem. February 1959, the Canadian Prime Minister canceled the whole program. It was thought by some that new missiles could defend the nation, along with existing aircraft and assets. This was incorrect. This meant that Canada was left with a gap and nothing to fill it. So guess what? Yet again, the Voodoo's called upon to fill a role when another aircraft wasn't available. And the U.S. Air Force was more than happy to sell, lend, whatever, enough to equip 5 squadrons and give trainers to Canada. So what's the problem? U.S. is willing. Obviously the military needs them. Well, politics. There was back and forth wrangling, which actually delayed things into 1961. Finally, an agreement was signed in June, and on July 24, the 101B entered Canadian service as the CF-101B Voodoo. And these would just be technically used Air Force aircraft, but they were essentially brand new right off the production lines. And very quickly they would be delivered that year and into 1962. And they would get a total of 56 standard two-seaters and 10 of the two-seat dual-control trainers, which again, combat capable. And this allowed 5 squadrons to fly the plane, plus 1 operational trainer conversion squadron. 6. Although they would actually retire 9 older squads, although 1 would get reformed and back and forth, and it's a thing. Either way, by 63, they'd all re-equipped. But, would you know, there was another issue. Not with the airplane, it was doing just fine. No, with the airplane fires. By this point, the 101B's standard ordnance were 2 AIM-4 Falcons and 2 Genie nuclear rockets. But in the beginning, the Canadians did not want nukes around their soil. Now, they had kind of agreed to participate in the whole program back in 58, but not really. So this was a whole other thing. A lot of people in Canada didn't want Canada to become nuclear operational, to, be in the direct crosshairs of all that crap, as if the U.S. getting nuked wouldn't immediately blow back on Canada too. But yeah, I get it. Politically, by the mid-60s, it was a hot button issues. Hippies were coming around. This actually would lead to the collapse of the current government, and a new government would form, and thus in August 1963, agreement was inked with the U.S., a bit of a compromise. Basically, the Genies would be on board 101s, but they would still be U.S. property, and they could only be launched, only be used if the U.S. took charge and agreed with Canadian officials. So essentially, U.S. officers were on base to legally own and protect and vouch for the security of the weapons. And they also took a lot of time training the pilots on how to operate with them, which actually delayed their service well into 1965. So by 65, Canadian CF Voodoos started having the Genies on board. Before that, they just carried 4 AIM-4 Falcons. But now they would do the 2 and 2 just like American aircraft. Now, these would fly for a number of years pretty uneventfully. Squadrons would, come up, stand up, be disbanded, reorganized. Obviously, they didn't have to use them in anger, although I do believe that they flew out of Iceland some. But mostly it was from Canada because, Canada's not actually that far from Russia, going by a Santa Claus route. The point was, by 1970, some of the airframes were kind of getting a high number of hours. After all, these were kept on high alert readiness. They're expected to be in the air within 5 minutes if needed, because, well, what good's a rapid response if you don't rapid respond? And this would actually begin the Peace Wings program. And that's actually what this model's from here. Between 70 and 72, Canada would actually trade in their 56, actually 56 Voodoos. They somehow managed to lose about 10 of them for new, fresh examples. Again, these were actually old stock, some of them earlier airframes than even the ones they had, but they had far fewer flight hours on them. So they would trade in their existing models for new, spiffy ones. And then once in Canada, Bristol would modify them with Canadian equipment standards. And then they would go into service and continue there for a number of years. This meant that technically 132 CF-101 Voodoos existed, although only half at one time. Now, the ones that America took back were scrapped, except for 22, which were hastily converted by LTV into RF-101B reconnaissance aircraft. Yeah, there and again, it was meant to be an interim solution. They essentially pulled off the weapons and gave it a photo nose. But only 22 of these were done. They only flew with the Nevada National Guard for 3 or 4 years. I think it was like 72 to 75. Not very long. It was supposed to be a cheap way to get them some recce aircraft. It ended up being grossly expensive. I know, it's a shocker that something that was supposed to be economical in America turned out to be more expensive than just buying fucking new aircraft. But hey, you can tell the idea of a budget is kind of gone now for the military. Anyway, back to Canada. By 1977, the Voodoo's kind of getting long in the tooth. Vietnam War, new technology. They started looking for its eventual replacement. And in 1980, they selected the FA-18 Hornet. Good multi-role aircraft. I can understand why Canada would. And by mid-82, the first squadron started converting from the CF-101s to the new CF-18s. And in 1984, 2 more squads would convert, and actually it was announced to the public that the Voodoos, frankly, rather popular service. The public seemed to rather like this. In some ways, it was more popular in Canada and more noticed than it ever was in America. And then in 1985, the final full squadron traded in their 101s, meaning that it was effectively out of service. In fact, only 2 were left flying in Canada. One was actually the so-called electric Voodoo, which in America had been fitted with the ECM equipment from an RB-57 Canberra, and it was intended for something greater, but the program was canceled, so you just had the one prototype, so Canada was leasing it from the US for whatever reason. I'm sure testing and whatnot. But it was returned to America in early April of 1987, and then on April 9, the same year, the last CF-101F, so dual control trainer, took its final flight. It would actually be used as a lawn ornament for a while, be bounced around a couple of times, and eventually end up in a museum. Not only would this be the last flight in Canada, This will be the last flight in the world of a Voodoo in military and governmental service, thus bringing to end quite a respectable career when you consider they started flying in earnest in 1957. They made it just shy within a few weeks of 30 years. Longer than most of that era. And not all that many were lost, unlike, say, the Thud. Then again, the Thud had a lot more holes shot in it. But it did serve in Canada, and has a lot going for there. So what do you think? So yeah, very interesting story. Specs, they're all lined up. We have a wingspan of over 39.5 feet. Overall length, the reconnaissance is the longest at about 69 feet. The B models are about 67.5 feet, so not much shorter. It's all in the nose. And again, top speed about 1.5, top speed of about 1.8, give or take. Max altitude for the single-seaters, about 52,000 feet. Again, they were meant for low altitude bombing, which translated into photo reconnaissance for the same. For the Interceptor, max altitude of about 58,000 feet. Again, for intercepting bombers. Of course, armament, very different. 1 nuke, 4 cannons, 2 nuclear rockets, and 2 guided missiles, or 4 guided missiles. Originally, like I said, they planned for 6, but I don't believe any were ever produced with that ability. All could carry 2 tanks, giving, like I said, about a 3,000 mile range, give or take. Other factors. The Bs were all weather, the As and the Cs weren't. But yeah, I think it's a very creative, very interesting aircraft, and one worth remembering. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't have anything like the place in history of the later F-4, but it did directly inspire it. Like I said, there was even a planned version using the J-79 engines, but this was always meant to be an interim solution. But the fact is, it could have so easily not made it past prototype or just a small rate of production. Seems like every time it was out, people would just return to the design and just modify it to suit their needs. In fact, it never really was its original design, a penetration fighter or bomber escort. Not really. It did about everything else, though. What's your favorite, though? I think it would be cool to have one in the Southeast Asian camo scheme. The tactical fighter version, like the one stationed in England, typically had kind of the gray and white paint finish. Like I said, the early ones had the natural metal, which was kind of a thing for that day. Pretty typical Air Force colors. And Canada gave theirs a similar but unique marking setup. Really, the Canadian aircraft were only different internally. That's why I don't have more variants. Most of the differences are pretty well internal. Although I wouldn't mind having one with a little nuke hanging on the bottom. Speaking of on the bottom, I want to talk about the models themselves when we close this video out. These are quite long. But even though they're almost all metal, the wings, the body, even the nose up to a certain point, even the vertical tail is metal, although the horizontals, because they're so thin, the stabulators, they're plastic. Even though it's all metal, because it's a very slender aircraft, it's not that heavy. But it's heavy enough. I hate the stands the Bs come with. In fact, I've had to glue my stands, not to the planes, thank God, but the top to the middle stem section, because this is plastic, the whole stand. And I just found that mine were tipping back and back and back. In fact, I had a plane break because the stand itself decided to flip. That was a long time ago. But yeah, I'm happy to report the C has a metal stem, which gives a little better weight balance. Also, instead of having a stand, it actually slots in to the center line like how Hobbymaster does with their Sukhois. I know some might find a hole in the middle unsightly. You know what I find unsightly? A broken plane. Also, it really works on the C's because they have a hard point there anyway, so you don't really make anything. I think their thoughts with the B's, since there wasn't really anything meant to be in the middle of the plane, don't put a stand there. But you know what? Again, with the Sukhois, there's nothing there, and they still do. Let's go with this stand. So I'm happy to see they improved it. I mentioned with the canopies on the B's, they actually hinge, which is cool, but it's hard to get them in the up position to stay there. I noticed with the C, you get 2 separate canopies, an open and a closed. I can see pros and cons to each, but overall, I think you're better off having 2 separate canopies. Plus, hinges can break or twist. Of course, this has the photo nose with the high altitude cameras back here. That's pretty neat. I think they did a really good job with it. It feels good. They didn't just stick a new nose on the B and call it a day. The engines are done right. Even it has the smaller intakes. Yeah, when they went to the 55s over the 13s on the real planes, the intakes changed, and they did alter them. They even gave this one the earlier style tanks. So it's pretty much an entirely new mold, which probably explains why it took a long time for this to come out. In fact, the fact that they do even the 101B is pretty neat in and of itself. And by the way, the pallet on these, even though when you get them, the missiles are glued in, they actually are removable. They're not, part of it. So you can remove the Genie rockets. I've seen some people do that. They don't want them on like a National Guard aircraft. Or you could even replace them with Falcons. I've considered doing that, doing a full Falcon layout for my Canadian. If it were an early style F-101, I might actually do it. But since it's very clearly the later style with the Erst in the front, I'll just leave it alone. But it's not just one plastic piece, which made me happy. I do wish the spinny pallet had more positive detents to keep it in position. As it is, it just spins more or less freely. There's a bit of a stop on one side to keep it from going all the way over and over and over like a tilt-a-whirl, but overall, I really like how they did it. And I like these Century Series aircraft. It is really great that Hobbymaster gave us the entire line. Heck, we even got an F-110 Spectre. And we got, of course, several F-111 Aardvarks. I know those aren't really considered part of the Century Series directly, but hey, why not? And none of them are bad. The 102s and 106s are particularly nice, and I love Hobbymaster's 105. Their Starfighters are neat. If there's one that I'm less than crazy about how they did it, was the 100, but even it's not a loser. It's just, it doesn't seem quite as nice as the others. But still not a bad bird. U.S. history. Good fun. I've been trying not to pick up aircraft lately because they're so expensive, but I knew I had to at least get this RF-101C Voodoo. And I'm glad I did. You can feel all the fuel tankage here. It's even a different shape in the fuselage. Like, yeah, it really is all new tooling. So I'd rather wait for something and have it done right than rush it out and have it wrong. Hobbymaster did do an RF-101B, one of those 22. It wasn't bad, but it had a few oddities. For example, it had Falcon missiles on the bottom, which is just strange. That one felt a little rushed out, but it did come out during COVID, or at least it was in development during COVID, so yeah. But I wouldn't mind if they had re-released that one with the proper camera set in the bottom instead of the missiles. I may get the 101C when it comes out, just to have one with the cannon, especially if it does come with a bomb for the center line. We'll see. It's, time. It's not due out till the summer, which in Hobby Master speak probably means end of the year at the earliest. They're always really late. Oh well. But what do you think, guys? And next time, well, we're going to check on what Douglas was up to around this same time period, because I've got some new models from that company as well. And then that'll be a great lead-in on a third video to talk about the merger of two great historic American aviation giants. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.